God is with you right now, even if you don't feel it. And that's exactly what's messing with your mind, isn't it? Because you wake up with that weight again, that quiet, unexplainable heaviness. And no matter how much you try to pray, it feels like your words don't go anywhere. Like they hit a ceiling and fall back down on you. And the scariest part isn't the silence. It's what that silence starts to make you believe. You haven't walked away. You're still here, still trying, still reaching. But instead of feeling closer to God, you feel nothing. No peace, no clarity. Just this growing question in the back of your mind. Is he vanity the long stay? The harder it becomes to ignore what it's doing inside you. Because now it's not just silence, it's doubt, it's exhaustion. It's that quiet fear that maybe something is wrong with you. Or worse, that God has stepped back without you realizing it. But what if that's not true at all? What if the thing making you feel like God is absent is actually the reason you're missing him right now? You wake up, and before anything even happens, there's already something heavy sitting inside you. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's quiet, but persistent. Like a weight you can't explain. You go through the motions, you get up. You try to focus. You try to move forward, but something feels off. Something feels distant. And deep down, there's a question out loud, but it keeps echoing in your mind. Where is God in all of this? You still pray. You haven't stopped. Maybe your prayers are shorter now. Maybe they feel more like routine than connection. But you still try. You still speak the words, hoping something will shift, hoping something will respond. And yet, it feels like your words don't go anywhere. Like the rages then stoppy. As if there's a ceiling between you and heaven. And that's what confuses you the most. Because it's not that you've walked away from God. It's not that you've decided you don't believe anymore. If anything, you're still here, still trying, still holding on. But instead of feeling close to him, you feel nothing. No peace, no clarity, no sense of his presence, just silence. And that silence starts to do something to your mind. At first, it's just a question. Why does this feel so empty? But then the question begins to grow. Is God even listening? Did I do something wrong? Is this my fault? And without realizing it, your thoughts slowly begin to shift. What started as confusion starts turning into doubt. You look at other people, and they seem so sure. They talk about feeling God, sensing his presence, experiencing peace. And you wonder, why not me? Why does it feel so natural for them, but so distant for you? You start comparing your inner world to what you think this looks like, and the gap feels overwhelming. So you try harder. You try to focus more when you pray. You try to say the right things. You try feel something, anything that reassures you that God is there. But the more you try to force it, the more frustrated you become, because feelings don't come on command, and the absence of them only makes everything feel worse. And now you're stuck in a cycle. You don't feel God, so you start questioning. The questioning creates distance in your thoughts. That distance makes it even harder to feel anything, and the silence becomes louder, heavier, more noticeable. But here's the part that's hardest to admit. You're not just confused, you're tired. Tired of trying to feel something that doesn't come. Tired of wondering if your faith is real. Tired of carrying this quiet fear that maybe God is further away than you thought. And yet, even in that exhaustion, something inside you hasn't let go. You're still here. That matters more than you realize. Because if you really think about it, this isn't a story of someone who abandoned faith. This is the story of someone who stayed even when it stopped. Feeling real, someone who kept showing up even when there was no emotional reward. Someone who kept reaching out into silence. But that raises an even deeper question. If you're still seeking, if you're still praying, if you're still holding on, even in the middle of this dryness, then what does that say about where God actually is? Because maybe the real issue isn't that God has disappeared. Maybe the real issue is that you've been expecting his presence to feel a certain way. And when it doesn't match that expectation, your mind starts to interpret it as absence. But what if that interpretation is wrong? What if the silence you're experiencing doesn't mean distance at all? What if the problem isn't that God isn't there, but that you've unknowingly tied his presence to something unstable, your emotions? And if that's true, then everything changes. Because now the question is no longer just, where is God? Now, the question becomes, what if he's been here the whole time and he just didn't recognize him? And if that's the case, then how do you begin to see what you've been missing? There's something subtle happening beneath everything you've been feeling, and if you don't recognize it, it will quietly shape your entire relationship with God without you even realizing it. You've been measuring God's presence by your emotions, not intentionally, not consciously, but somewhere along the way, you learn it maybe without anyone ever saying it directly, that if God is near, you should feel something: peace, warmth, clarity, assurance, something noticeable, something undeniable. So when those feelings are there, you feel secure, you feel connected, you feel like your faith is working. But when those feelings disappear, everything starts to feel uncertain, and that's where the tension begins. Because your emotions don't stay the same. They shift, they rise and fall depending on your circumstances, your thoughts, your energy, even things you can't explain. One day, feel calm. The next day, you feel overwhelmed. One moment you feel hopeful, the next moment you feel anxious. And without realizing it, you've placed something unstable at the center of something that was never meant to depend on it. Faith. This is the misunderstanding that quietly creates so much internal struggle. You stop believing that your feelings are evidence of God's presence. But they're not. Feelings are real, but they are not reliable. They reflect what's happening inside you, not necessarily what is true beyond you. They respond to your thoughts, your environment, your fears, your expectations. And when you rely on them to define something as constant as God, you end up in a constant cycle of uncertainty. Because if God's presence depends on how you feel, then His presence will seem inconsistent. But that creates a contradiction, because everything Scripture reveals about God points to something completely different. It shows a God who does not change, a God who is not shifting with your emotions, a God whose presence is anchored in promise, not perception. As the Bible itself affirms, it is the ultimate and reliable revelation of who God is and how He works. So now you're faced with something important. Either God is consistent, or your perception of Him is. He doesn't move closer one day and further the next based on your emotional state. He doesn't withdraw because you feel disconnected. He doesn't become distant because your mind is overwhelmed. But it feels like He does. And that's the tension you've been living in. Your feelings are telling you one story, but truth is telling you another. So which one do you trust? This is where faith actually begins, not when everything feels aligned, but when it doesn't. Faith starts in the moment where your emotions and truth don't match, and you have to decide which one defines your reality. Because if you follow your feelings, you will always be chasing something that moves. You'll keep trying to recreate moments of emotional clarity. You'll keep searching for experiences that make you feel close to God again. And when those moments fade, as they always do, you'll find yourself back in the same place, questioning everything. But if you begin to anchor yourself in truth instead, something shifts, not immediately in how you feel, but in how you stand. You start realizing that God's presence is not something you have to feel to believe. It's something you trust because He said it's true. And that changes the entire foundation of your faith. Because now, instead of asking, "Do I feel God right now?" you begin asking, "What is actually true right now?" And the answer doesn't depend on your emotions, it depends on who God is. But this raises another question, one that might feel even more uncomfortable. If God has been present this whole time, if His nearness hasn't changed, then why does it feel like He's silent? Why does it feel like there's a distance you can't explain? Because even if you start to accept that feelings aren't the foundation, the silence still remains. And silence is harder to understand than emotion. So what do you do with a God who is present, but quiet? And what if that silence isn't what you think it is? There's a part of this journey that feels even harder than emotional emptiness, and that is silence. Because emotions, at least, are something, even if they're confusing, even if they're unstable. They still feel like movement. But silence feels like nothing. And when you're trying to connect with God, nothing can feel unbearable. You pray, and there's no response. You wait, and nothing changes. You listen, and all you hear is your own thoughts echoing back at you. And slowly, Without realizing it, you begin to interpret that silence. Maybe God is distant. Maybe he's disappointed. Maybe he's not responding because something is wrong with you. But what if silence doesn't mean what you think it means? Because one of the most common assumptions we make in moments like this is that silence equals absence. That if God is not speaking in a way we can recognize, then he must not be there. But that assumption has a problem. It places the responsibility of understanding God entirely on your ability to perceive him. And that's a heavy burden to carry because your perception is limited. It's influenced by your emotions, your thoughts, your expectations. So if God's presence depended on your ability to recognize it clearly at all times, then your connection with him would always feel fragile. But that's not how God works. Throughout Scripture, there's a pattern that repeats itself in ways that are easy to overlook. God often does his deepest work in seasons where he feels the most silent, not absent. Silent. And those two things are not the same. Silence is not an activity. Silence is not neglect. Silence is not rejection. Silence is often where transformation begins. But that's hard to accept when you're in it, because from your perspective, nothing is happening. There are no clear signs, no immediate answers, no emotional reassurance, just waiting, just uncertainty. And your mind doesn't like uncertainty, so it tries to fill the gap. It starts creating explanations to make sense of the silence. It tells you stories that feel logical in the moment but are rooted more in fear than in truth. It convinces you that if God cared, you would feel something, that if he was working, you would see something, that if he was near, you would know it without question. But what if that expectation is the very thing distorting your understanding? What if God's silence is not a sign of distance, but an invitation to go deeper? Because when everything is loud, when emotions are strong, when answers come quickly, when everything feels clear, it's easier to depend on what you experience. But when it's quiet, when there's no emotional renforcement, when things seem obvious, something different is required. Trust. And not the kind of trust that's supported by evidence. Not the kind that comes easily because everything feels aligned, a deeper kind. The kind that chooses to believe even when there's no immediate confirmation. And that kind of trust doesn't grow in noise. It grows in silence. This is something where we don't to feel it yet. Because instead of asking, why isn't God responding the way I want, you begin to ask, what if he's working in a way I don't yet understand? That question changes everything. It doesn't remove the discomfort. The silence still feels real. The waiting still feels long. But now, instead of interpreting the silence as absence, you start to hold space for the possibility that something is happening beneath the surface. Something you can't see yet. Something you can't feel yet. But something real. And that creates a new kind of tension. Because now you're no longer just dealing with silence. You're dealing with the challenge of trusting without visible movement. And that brings you face to face with something even deeper. If your feelings can't define God's presence, and silence doesn't mean he's gone, then why does your mind keep pulling you back into doubt? Why is it so hard to hold on to truth, even when you're stunned? Because the real battle might not be in your circumstances. It might be happening somewhere much closer, inside your own mind. There's a reason why, even after everything you're beginning to understand, the struggle doesn't immediately disappear. Because the real battle isn't just about what you feel, it's about what you think. Your mind is constantly interpreting your experience. Every moment, every silence, every emotion, it's all being processed, explained, and given meaning by your thoughts. And the truth is, your thoughts don't always tell you what is real. They tell you what feels convincing. And those are not the same thing. When you wake up and feel that heaviness, your mind doesn't stay neutral. It starts building a narrative. It begins connecting dots, drawing conclusions, creating explanations. And most of the time, it does this automatically without you even noticing. This feels empty, so something must be wrong. I don't feel God, so he must be distant. I've been waiting, so maybe he's not responding. These thoughts don't announce themselves as assumptions. They feel like truth. And because they feel true, you begin to believe them. And once you believe them, they start shaping everything else, your emotions, your expectations, even your faith. This is why the struggle feels so Internal because it is. The battlefield isn't out there somewhere. It's not just in your circumstances. It's in the quiet, ongoing conversation happening inside your mind. And here's what makes it even more complex. Your mind naturally leads toward fear, not because you're weak, not because your faith is broken, but because your mind is wired to protect you. It tries to anticipate problems, avoid disappointment, make sense of uncertainty. So when it encounters silence, it fills that silence with the worst-case explanation. It assumes distance instead of presence. It assumes rejection instead of purpose. It assumes absence instead of trust. And unless you interrupt that pattern, it keeps repeating. This is why you can understand something spiritually and still feel stuck mentally, because knowing truth is one thing, but choosing to think according to that truth is another. And that choice doesn't happen automatically. You have to become aware of what your mind is doing. You have to notice the moment when a thought begins to pull you away from truth. Not after it's already taken over, but while it's forming, when it's still subtle, when it's still a suggestion, not a conclusion. Because once a thought settles in as a belief, it becomes much harder to challenge. So, the question becomes, how do you respond when your mind tells you something that contradicts what you know is true? Do you follow it, or do you question it? This is where spiritual growth becomes very practical, because it's not just about what you believe in a general sense. It's about what you choose to agree with in specific moments. When your mind says, God is distant, you have to pause and ask, is that true? Or is that what I feel? When your thoughts say, nothing is happening, you have to ask, do I actually know that? Or am I assuming it? This is not about denying your emotions. It's not about pretending everything feels fine when it doesn't. It's about refusing to let your thoughts define reality without being tested. Because not every thought deserves your agreement. And this is where many people get stuck without realizing it. They assume that because a thought appears, it must be valid. But your mind can produce thoughts based on fear, insecurity, past experiences, or simple exhaustion. And if you don't filter those thoughts through truth, they begin to shape a reality that isn't accurate. So instead of living anchored in what God has promised, you start living according to what your mind suggests. And that creates instability, because your mind will always have something to say. There will always be another doubt, another question, another what if. So if your peace depends on having perfectly calm thoughts, you will never find it. But if your peace comes from learning how to respond to those thoughts, how to recognize them, challenge them, and redirect them, then something begins to change. Not all at once, not perfectly, but steadily. You begin to create space between what you think and what is actually true. And in that space, something powerful happens. Clarity. Because now, instead of being pulled in every direction by your thoughts, you start standing on something deeper, something more stable. Truth. But this leads to another challenge, one that goes even further than your thoughts. Because even if you start recognizing what's true, even if you begin to separate your thoughts from reality, there's still a part of you that wants something more. You want confirmation. You want reassurance. You want to feel certain. And that desire leads to one of the hardest questions in this entire journey. What does it mean to trust God when you still don't have the evidence you're looking for? There's a part of you that keeps waiting for something to make this easier. A sign, a feeling, a moment of clarity that removes all the uncertainty. Because deep down, you don't just want to believe, you want to be sure. And that desire is completely human. You want reassurance that you're not walking in the wrong direction. You want to know that your prayers are heard, that your faith is not misplaced, that your trust is not empty. So you look for evidence, something you can feel, something you can point to, something that confirms without a doubt that God is there and that He's working. But what happens when that evidence doesn't come? What happens when you keep showing up and there's still no confirmation? Nuclear answer. This is where faith is stretched in a way that feels uncomfortable, because now you're faced with a choice. Do you wait to trust until you have proof, or do you trust even when the proof hasn't appeared? This is where many people hesitate, not because they don't want to trust God, but because trusting without evidence feels risky. It feels uncertain. It feels like stepping into something without knowing if it will hold you. and your mind resists that. It wants guarantees. It wants clarity before commitment. It wants to feel safe before it lets go. But faith doesn't work that way. Faith is not a reaction to evidence. Faith is a decision in the absence of it. And that changes how you approach everything. Because if you only trust when you feel something, then your trust is still dependent on your emotions, and you're back in the same cycle you've been trying to escape. But if you choose to trust when you don't feel anything, something deeper begins to form, a different kind of stability. Not the kind that comes from constant reassurance, but the kind that comes from quiet conviction. This is where your relationship with God begins to mature, because instead of needing Him to prove His presence over and over again, you begin to rest in what you already know to be true, not because you feel it, but because He said it. And that's not easy. There will be moments where your mind still questions, moments where your emotions still feel empty, moments where the silence still feels long. But now, instead of interpreting those moments as failure, you start to see them as opportunities. Opportunities to choose trust again, not once, not in a single dramatic moment, but consistently, quietly, daily. And that's where faith becomes real, not in the moments where everything feels aligned, but in the moments where it doesn't, and you still choose to believe. This is also where your actions begin to matter more than your feelings, because trust is not just something you think, it's something you live. It shows up in small, consistent decisions. You keep praying even when it feels quiet. You keep showing up even when it feels routine. You keep believing even when your emotions don't support it. And always in your circumstances, not always in your feelings, but in you begin to develop endurance. A kind of inner strength that doesn't depend on constant emotional feedback, a steadiness that remains even when things feel uncertain, and that steadiness becomes the evidence you were looking for. Not external proof, but internal transformation. But here's something important to understand, something that often goes unnoticed. As you begin to live this way, as you begin to trust without needing immediate evidence, you might expect that suddenly everything will feel different. That peace will become constant, that clarity will always be present, that doubt will disappear. But that's not always how it works, because the final shift in this journey is not about eliminating uncertainty completely. It's about seeing something you couldn't see before, something that changes how you interpret everything that came before it. Because what if, through all of this, through the silence, the questions, the waiting, there was something you were expecting that God never promised in the first place? And what if realizing that is the key to finally experiencing peace, not as a feeling, but as something deeper? There's a realization that doesn't come all at once, but when it begins to settle in, it changes everything. It's quiet, almost unnoticeable at first. You start to see that maybe the problem was never God's absence. Maybe it was your expectation, because somewhere along the way, without even realizing it, you formed an idea of what God's presence should feel like. You expected peace to always feel warm. You expected His nearness to always feel obvious. You expected clarity to come quickly and reassurance to follow your prayers. And when those things didn't happen the way you imagined, you assumed something was wrong. But what if nothing was wrong? What if God was present the entire time, just not in the way you expected? That thought alone begins to shift something deep inside you, because now, instead of chasing a specific feeling, you start questioning the expectation itself. Why did I believe that God's presence had to feel a certain way? Where did that idea come from? And more importantly, is it actually true? This is where clarity begins to grow. Not because everything suddenly makes sense, but because you're no longer measuring God by something unstable. You're no longer asking, "Do I feel Him?" as the primary question. You're starting to ask, "Has He said He's here?" And that changes the direction of your focus, because the truth has been there all along. God's presence was never something you had to earn, feel, or prove. It was something He already established, something constant, something unshaken by your emotional state. And yet, you were trying to experience it through something that constantly changes, your feelings. So now, as this realization settles in, something unexpected happens. You stop striving, not completely, not perfectly, but there's a noticeable shift. You're no longer trying so hard to force an emotional connection. You're no longer analyzing every moment, trying to detect whether God feels close or far. You're no longer exhausting yourself chasing something that was never meant to be chased. Instead, you begin to rest, not in your feelings, but in truth. And that rest feels different. It's not overwhelming. It's not intense. It doesn't come with a rush of emotion or a sudden wave of certainty. It's quieter than that, but it's steadier. It's the kind of peace that doesn't depend on what you feel in the moment. The kind that doesn't disappear when your emotions shift. The kind that remains even when things are unclear. And for the first time, you start to understand something important. Peace was never meant to be something you feel all the time. It was meant to be something you stand on that changes how you interpret everything. The silence doesn't feel as threatening anymore. The lack of emotion doesn't feel like failure. The questions don't feel as overwhelming. Not because they're gone, but because they no longer define your reality. And here's where the transformation becomes real. You begin to notice that even in moments where you still don't feel God, you're not as shaken as you used to be. You're not spiraling into the same doubts. You're not assuming the worst. You're not questioning everything as quickly. Why? Because something inside you has shifted from needing confirmation to trusting truth. And that's a deeper kind of faith. Not emotional, not dependent, but rooted. Still, there's one final piece to this, because even though you're starting to understand this truth, even though you're beginning to experience a different kind of peace, there's still a question lingering in the background. What does life actually look like now if you're not relying on feelings, if you're not chasing emotional reassurance, if you're learning to trust even in silence? Then how do you move forward from here? What does it look like to live this out every day? Because understanding something internally is one thing, but living it consistently, that's where everything comes together. So what does this actually look like now? Not in theory, not just something you understand for a moment, but something you live, because this is where everything comes together. You're no longer the same person who woke up feeling that quiet panic, wondering where God was, measuring his presence by your emotions, and feeling lost every time those emotions disappeared. Something has shifted, not around you, but within you. Now, when you wake up and that same heaviness tries to settle in, it doesn't carry the same power. It might still be there. The emotions don't vanish overnight. The silence doesn't suddenly turn into constant clarity, but your response is different. You no longer immediately assume that something is wrong. You pause, and in that pause, there's awareness. This is what I feel, but this is not what defines what's true. That simple distinction begins to shape everything, because now, instead of being pulled into a cycle of doubt, you remain anchored, not perfectly, not every second, but steadily. You've learned that your feelings can exist without controlling your faith, and that changes how you move through your day. You still pray, but not to force a feeling. You still seek God, but not to prove his presence. You still wait, but not with fear. There's a quiet confidence now, not loud, not dramatic, not something you need to explain to anyone else, but it's there, and it's real, because you've stopped chasing something that was never meant to be chased. You've stopped trying to turn faith into an emotional experience that constantly reassures you, and instead, you've stepped into something deeper, trust, the kind that doesn't depend on what you feel in the moment. And here's what's surprising about that. When you stop chasing feelings, peace begins to appear in a different way, not as a sudden emotion, but as stability. You notice that your mind is quieter, not silent, but less chaotic. The thoughts still come, but they don't take over as easily. You recognize them for what they are, just thoughts, not truth. You notice that the silence doesn't feel as heavy. It's still there, but it no longer feels like rejection. It feels neutral, even purposeful. At times, you notice that your relationship with God feels less like something fragile and more like something grounded. And maybe, for the first time, you realize this. God was never distant. You just expected him to feel different. That realization doesn't just answer your original question, it transforms it. If God is with me, why don't I feel him? Now becomes, God is with me, even when I don't feel him. And that changes everything, because now your faith is no longer dependent on emotional confirmation. It's built on something stronger, something unchanging, truth. And that truth carries you in a way feelings never could. It carries you through uncertain days. It carries you through quiet seasons. It carries you when your mind tries to pull you back into doubt. Not because everything is easy now, but because you're no longer unstable. You've learned how to stand. And that's what spiritual maturity looks like. Not constant emotional highs, not always feeling close, but remaining rooted, even when you don't. So as you move forward from here, you don't need to keep asking, do I feel God right now? You already know the answer that matters. He's with you in the silence, in the waiting, in the moments that feel empty, in the thoughts you're learning to challenge, in the quiet growth you can't always see. And that truth is enough, not because it satisfies your emotions every time, but because it anchors your life in something real. So, if this message spoke to you in a place you couldn't fully explain, take a moment, sit with it, let it settle. And if you've been struggling with this silence, with this distance, with this quiet tension between what you feel and what you believe, know that you're not alone in it. But more importantly, you're not abandoned in it. If this helped bring clarity to something you've been carrying, you can share your thoughts below. Sometimes putting it into words is the first step toward understanding it more deeply. And if you want to keep growing in this kind of faith, one that is steady, grounded, and not dependent on feelings, you can continue walking this journey one step at a time. Because in the end, it's not about always feeling God. It's about learning to trust that He's there, even when you don't. And maybe right now, that's exactly the kind of faith you've been building all along.